Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to walk together into a night I'll never forget. The air is still, the kind of stillness that feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath. I'm sitting by the window, staring at the street lamp outside. Its light flickers, spilling pale gold across the empty sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then silence swallows the sound whole. My mug of tea has gone cold, untouched for hours, because my mind keeps circling back to something I saw earlier, a detail so small, so ordinary, that anyone else would have missed it. But I didn't. I couldn't. It's the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the way his hand lingered over a folder before shoving it into his bag, the way he glanced over his shoulder, twice, before leaving the room. It wasn't guilt written on his face. It was calculation. And that one look, that one shift in his expression, planted a splinter in my thoughts I couldn't pull out. I wish I could say I forgot about it. I wish I could say I let it go. But something deep inside told me I had just glimpsed a door I wasn't supposed to see. One that, if I opened it, would lead me somewhere I could never come back from. And yet, curiosity can be louder than reason. It can whisper that you're the only one who can figure it out, the only one who sees the truth. It can tell you that maybe, just maybe, you're meant to pull that door open, even if it hurts you. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Also, I want you to comment below. Tell me where and when you're watching this. I want to imagine the exact moment our paths are crossing, because from here on out, you and I are stepping into the same story. We'll walk down the same dark hallway, and you'll see, piece by piece, how one tiny thread can unravel an entire life. I didn't know it then, but I was about to stumble onto a truth so heavy, it would crush me long before it set me free. I didn't go looking for trouble, at least not at first. In our town, there were people everyone seemed to trust without question, and he was one of them. You know the type. Someone whose name carried weight, whose handshake could close a deal faster than any signed contract. He was the man who showed up to every community event with a smile that could light up the stage, who paid for school fundraisers without being asked, who remembered everyone's children's names. And somehow, he remembered mine. He wasn't just someone in the community to me. He was in my orbit more than I realized, at meetings, at social gatherings, even at the coffee shop where I sometimes worked on my laptop. It wasn't that we were friends, exactly. But there was always this sense that he noticed me, maybe even liked me, that made what came later so much harder to understand. Back then, I didn't see the cracks. I didn't notice the way his smile tightened when certain names came up. I didn't think much of the way he always seemed to change the subject when conversations drifted toward money, or how people sometimes glanced at each other before answering his questions. I thought the flicker I'd seen in his eyes that night was nothing more than stress. Everyone has bad days, right? But then, little things began stacking up. One afternoon, I saw him talking to a man I didn't recognize. They were standing in the parking lot outside a hardware store, their heads bent close together. When they noticed me, they broke apart, fast, too fast, and the stranger walked away without a word. He smiled at me, that easy smile everyone loved, but it felt different this time. Thinner, hollow. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading into something harmless. But the truth was, my gut was starting to hum with a low, uneasy vibration. That's the thing about suspicion. It doesn't arrive with a bang. It creeps in, first as a whisper, then as a murmur, until it's loud enough to drown out everything else. One evening, at a community dinner, I sat at the far end of the table, watching him work the room. His laughter rolled like warm waves, his handshakes firm and confident. But when someone asked about a local project he'd promised to fund, his expression faltered for a fraction of a second before he smoothed it over. It was like watching a mask slip, just barely, before being fixed back into place. That was when I realized something. Either he was hiding something, or I was about to invent a problem where none existed. The difference? One would destroy him. The other would destroy me. I didn't know yet which path I was standing on, but I knew I was already walking it. It was late, later than I should have been awake, when the first real crack in his perfect image appeared. I'd gone out for a walk to clear my head, the kind of walk you take when you're restless but can't quite explain why. The streets were quiet, the air sharp with the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Streetlights pooled soft gold on the pavement, and my footsteps echoed in the stillness. I was passing by the side of the town's old library when I heard it, a voice, low and urgent, spilling from the alley beside the building. I slowed, instinctively keeping to the shadow of a nearby tree. It was his voice. At first, I couldn't make out the words, just the tone, sharp, clipped, nothing like the smooth, genial way he spoke in public. Another voice answered, equally low, but I could hear the strain in it. They were arguing. I edged closer, my pulse quickening, and finally caught a few words. They weren't much, but they were enough to tangle in my mind like a thorn. Papers, deadline, and don't let anyone find out. Then there was a pause, followed by the scrape of something metallic, maybe a briefcase latch, maybe a lock. I froze, my breath held tight in my chest. The second man muttered something I couldn't hear, and then footsteps shifted toward the open street. I stepped back quickly, my heel crunching against a loose bit of gravel. Silence. The conversation stopped. For a moment, the only sound was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I heard him again, but now his voice had changed, softer, controlled, almost friendly. "Who's there?" I didn't answer. I stepped back further into the darkness, letting the shadows swallow me. A few seconds later, the second man emerged from the alley, his head down, moving fast. I recognized him vaguely, a clerk from the municipal office. He didn't look up, and then he came out. His eyes swept the street, scanning. When they passed over my hiding spot, I had to fight the urge to shrink further away. I told myself I'd imagined the flicker of suspicion in his gaze, but I knew better. He saw me. He didn't call out again. Instead, he gave a faint smile, as if nothing had happened, and walked in the opposite direction, his stride unhurried. I stayed rooted to the spot long after they were gone, my mind turning over the words I'd overheard. Papers. Deadline. Don't let anyone find out. By the time I finally walked home, the rain had started to fall, cold and steady. Each drop felt like a countdown. I didn't know to what, but I knew I was closer to it than I had been the day before. That night, lying in bed, I replayed everything in my mind. I told myself there could be a harmless explanation, but deep down, I knew this was no harmless conversation, and it was only the beginning. Once you've seen the first crack, you can't stop looking for more. In the days after that night by the library, my senses seemed sharper. Every interaction with him, every passing conversation, every flicker of expression, it all felt loaded with meaning I hadn't noticed before. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I'd stumbled onto some trivial matter he wanted to keep private. But suspicion is like a magnifying glass. You start holding it over everything, and even the smallest details look dangerous. So, I started watching. I didn't follow him, not exactly, but I kept track. Where he went, who he spoke to, what days he left early, and what days he stayed late. My phone's calendar filled up with little notes, most of them meaningless on their own, but together, forming a picture I couldn't yet name. One morning, while walking past the post office, I spotted him stepping out with a thick envelope tucked under his arm. He looked both relieved and hurried, his gaze darting briefly to the street before he slipped the envelope into his briefcase. It could have been anything. Tax forms, legal documents, nothing unusual, except for the way he moved like someone trying not to be noticed. Later that same week, I saw him at the community center, talking with the same municipal clerk I'd glimpsed in the alley. They weren't arguing this time, they were laughing. But it was the kind of laughter that felt rehearsed, like they both knew it was important for anyone watching to think everything was fine. Still, I didn't have proof. That's when I started connecting with people who might know more, casually at first, asking small, harmless questions. Did they know him well? Did he seem stressed lately? The answers were vague. Some said he'd been distracted. Others said he'd been unusually generous. Then came the first real piece of the puzzle. I was leaving the grocery store when I overheard two older women chatting near the entrance. They didn't notice me listening, but their words stopped me cold. And I told her, if those papers get out, it'll be the end of him. The other woman shook her head. That's why he's so desperate to get them back. Can't have people asking questions, not with the election coming. Election. That single word lit up everything in my mind like a lightning strike. Suddenly, the secrecy, the urgency, the quiet meetings, it all had a new shape. If he was hiding something connected to his public position, then whatever it was could be big. But big secrets are dangerous. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me even before I knew the full truth. Because if he found out I was digging, it wouldn't just be his career on the line. It would be mine, my relationships, my life as I knew it. Still, I couldn't stop. I'd seen too much to turn away now. It was raining the night I found it, the proof. Not the whisper of a rumor, not a fragment of a conversation. Real, tangible evidence. The kind you can hold in your hand and feel the weight of. The rain had been falling since afternoon, soaking the streets until they glistened under the pale glow of the lamps. I was heading home when I noticed the municipal clerk from before, same man, same hurried steps, ducking into the side door of an old storage building near the edge of town. Something about the way he kept looking over his shoulder made me pause. I told myself to keep walking, but my feet didn't listen. Instead, I found myself standing in the shadows across the street, watching. Minutes passed. Then the door creaked open again, and out he came. But now his hands were empty. I waited until his footsteps faded before crossing. The building was locked, but years of growing up in a small town teach you things, like where loose boards tend to hide. I found one at the back, pried it up just enough to slip through, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of damp wood. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on rows of old cabinets and shelves stacked with boxes. Most were coated in a thick layer of neglect, but one corner looked recently disturbed. That's where I found it. A plain cardboard box, no label, shoved beneath a stack of other containers. I pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside were folders, dozens of them, each stamped with dates, signatures, and official seals. At first, it was just a blur of paper, but then I started to read. Contracts, land transfers, and, hidden among them, a series of signed approvals for a development project that didn't exist on any public record. I flipped through page after page, my pulse hammering harder with every one. There were signatures from multiple officials, people I knew by name, but at the center of it all was his. Always his. And then, tucked in the back of one folder, I found the most damning piece. A letter from a private company promising substantial consulting fees in exchange for expedited approval of a land purchase. It was bribery, written in careful, polite language. I didn't need to be a lawyer to understand what it meant. I stood there for a long time, the rain tapping against the windows, my hands shaking. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about a network, people in positions of power covering for each other, hiding their deals in plain sight. If this came to light, it wouldn't just ruin his career. It could topple half the leadership in our town. That's when I heard it, a door closing somewhere in the building. The flashlight trembled in my grip. My mind screamed to put the box back, to slip out the way I came before anyone knew I was here. But my hands, they clutched the folder tighter. Because in that moment, I knew. I was never going to unsee this. When you're holding something that could ruin someone's life, the weight isn't just in your hands, it's in your chest, your mind, your pulse. I drove home that night with the folder on the passenger seat, wrapped in an old towel like it was something fragile. My wipers beat back the rain in slow, rhythmic sweeps, each pass revealing a stretch of empty road that felt longer than the last. At every stoplight, I looked over at it, wondering what it would mean if I acted, and what it would cost me if I didn't. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were numb from gripping the wheel. I took the folder inside and laid it flat on my kitchen table. The yellow glow of the overhead light made the documents look older, heavier, like they'd been waiting for years for someone to really see them. That night, I barely slept. I paced the hallway, sat in the living room with the documents spread out around me, then stood at the window watching the rain streak down the glass. My mind kept turning over the same questions. If I bring this forward, will anyone believe me? Will they see me as a whistleblower? Or a troublemaker? And what happens when he finds out it was me? By morning, the rain had stopped, but the storm inside me hadn't. I called an old friend who used to work in investigative journalism. She listened quietly as I described the documents, then let out a long breath. "If you go down this road," she said, "you have to be ready for the backlash. You think he's going to sit there and take it? Number he'll come for you, and he won't fight fair." I knew she was right, and yet, the alternative, doing nothing, felt like its own kind of betrayal. Not just to the town, but to myself. That day, I scanned the most critical documents and saved them in multiple places. My laptop, an external drive, a cloud folder under a fake name. If he tried to destroy the originals, the truth would still exist somewhere. Still, I hesitated. It's one thing to know the truth. It's another to speak it aloud, to put your name to it. For 3 days, I carried the folder in my bag everywhere I went, as if keeping it close could somehow protect me. Each time I saw him in town, shaking hands, laughing, pretending, my stomach knotted tighter. Finally, I decided. I called a contact at a state oversight committee, someone with the authority to investigate. We agreed to meet quietly, away from town. As I drove to that meeting, I told myself I was doing the right thing. That truth mattered more than comfort, more than safety, more than the life I'd built. I handed over the folder with both hands, the way you might pass a newborn to someone you trust. I didn't know it yet, but in that moment, I'd lit a fuse I couldn't put out. For the first 48 hours after I handed over the folder, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. It was quiet relief, the kind that doesn't make you smile, but loosens the tension in your shoulders. I told myself I'd done my part. The evidence was in the right hands now, far from his reach. My role was over. Or so I thought. The first sign that I'd miscalculated came on the 3rd day. I walked into the cafe where I sometimes worked on my laptop. and the conversations that usually wrapped around me like a warm blanket fell silent. People glanced up from their tables, then quickly looked away. The barista, a young woman who'd always been friendly, handed me my coffee without meeting my eyes. It was subtle, but I felt it. Something in the air had shifted. That afternoon, the feeling followed me to the grocery store. Whispers seemed to ripple just out of earshot. An older man I'd known for years gave me a polite nod, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. By evening, the relief I'd felt was gone, replaced by a prickling unease. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from my old friend, the former journalist. "Something's moving. Brace yourself." She didn't elaborate, but I didn't need her to. It started small, an offhand comment on a local social media group about how certain people were making false accusations to get attention. Then it grew, whispers turning into rumors, rumors turning into claims that I had a personal vendetta, that I was bitter, unstable, desperate for relevance, and at the center of it all, him. He didn't address me directly, of course. He didn't have to. Instead, he made carefully crafted statements about the danger of false narratives and the sadness of seeing our community torn apart by unfounded claims. People wanted to believe him. They needed to believe him. He was the man they trusted. And I? I was just one person with a story that didn't fit the version of reality they'd grown comfortable with. It's astonishing how quickly the tide turns when the one you expose has more power, more influence, more allies. By the end of that week, invitations to regular gatherings stopped arriving. Emails I'd been waiting for never came. Calls went unanswered. I began to understand that this wasn't going to be a quiet investigation. This was going to be a war, and he'd fired the first shot without ever stepping into the open. One night, I stood at my window, watching the empty street below. Somewhere out there, he was already spinning his next move. He knew the rules of this game better than I did, and I had just stepped onto his board. When the counterattack came, it was swift, calculated, and devastating. I woke one morning to a message from a former colleague. "You should see this." It was a link to a local news article. The headline didn't name me, but it didn't need to. The description of the unnamed source, who'd made malicious allegations, was a mirror I couldn't avoid. The article painted the whistleblower, me, as someone with a history of personal grievances and conflicts with respected figures in the community. It suggested I'd misinterpreted documents out of context, driven by long-standing bitterness. The language was careful, but the intent was clear. Undermine the messenger, and the message dies. By the time I'd finished reading, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Calls I didn't want to answer, texts I didn't want to read. Some were from people I thought would support me, asking cautiously, "Is it true?" Others were from complete strangers, telling me to keep my nose out of things I didn't understand. That afternoon, I learned the smear campaign wasn't confined to the news. Online forums, community Facebook pages, even the comment section of the local library's website, everywhere I looked, there were versions of the same story. I was unstable, unreliable, and out for revenge. The worst part? It worked. Within a week, the investigation I'd triggered seemed to be drowning in a sea of doubt. The oversight committee hadn't dropped the matter, but their calls grew less frequent. The last time I spoke to my contact there, their tone had shifted, more formal, more distant, as though they were already questioning whether I was worth the trouble. He was winning. The isolation grew sharper with each passing day. Friends who used to greet me warmly now gave tight, polite nods. A neighbor I'd waved to for years turned and went inside when I stepped out to check my mailbox. And yet, the most dangerous blow hadn't landed yet. That came one evening when I received an anonymous envelope in the mail. Inside were printed screenshots, emails I'd written years ago, lifted out of their original context, highlighted to look incriminating. They weren't illegal or immoral, but they could be twisted to suggest I'd acted unprofessionally in the past. The message was clear. If you keep going, we will bury you. I sat at my kitchen table, the papers spread before me, and realized the truth. This wasn't just about silencing me. It was about making sure that, even if I shouted from the rooftops, no one would listen. I'd wanted to believe that exposing the truth would be enough. But now I understood. I was fighting someone who knew how to make the truth irrelevant, and I didn't have a playbook for that. It's strange how quickly the familiar becomes hostile. A month earlier, I could walk into the grocery store and bump into 3 people I'd known since childhood, each ready with a smile or a wave. Now, the same aisles felt like narrow corridors in a foreign place, every glance sharp, every whisper a shadow I couldn't quite catch. The loss of trust is like erosion. It doesn't always happen in one dramatic collapse. Sometimes it's the steady wearing down of your place in the world, grain by grain. At work, the shift was even more pronounced. I'd always been good at my job, met deadlines, helped colleagues, earned quiet respect. But suddenly, projects I'd been leading were reassigned without explanation. Meetings happened without me. My email inbox, once busy with requests and updates, grew eerily quiet. And then came the moment I'll never forget. I walked into the break room one morning, and 2 coworkers, people I'd had lunch with countless times, were sitting at the table. The moment they saw me, the conversation stopped. One of them cleared her throat, stood up, and walked out without a word. The other muttered something about needing to get back to work, and followed. It wasn't just distance, it was avoidance, as if proximity to me was dangerous. At night, I'd replay my days, searching for small moments of normalcy, but they were fewer and farther between. Even family gatherings grew strained. My cousin, who used to call me for advice on everything from recipes to relationships, hadn't spoken to me in weeks. When I finally reached out, her answer was cautious. I just don't want to get involved. That phrase, don't want to get involved, was becoming the chorus of my life. But involvement isn't always a choice. I was already in it, and the walls were closing in. I found myself pulling back too, not because I wanted to, but because the silence after hello felt worse than not speaking at all. The isolation was heavy, but there was something else creeping in alongside it. Doubt. Not doubt about what I'd seen or what I'd done, but doubt about whether it mattered anymore. If no one believed me, did the truth still have power? One night, I sat in my darkened living room with the folder of scanned evidence open on my laptop. The glow of the screen lit my face as I scrolled through page after page, each one a reminder of why I'd started. I told myself I hadn't lost yet, that the investigation was still ongoing, even if the world around me had turned cold. But deep down, I knew I was losing ground. Not because he'd disproved me, but because he'd convinced everyone else to stop listening. Losing people's trust is one thing. Losing your livelihood is another. It started subtly, like the way a tide pulls at your feet before you realize you're drifting. A contract I'd been promised for months fell through. A client who'd once praised my work sent a terse email. We've decided to go in another direction. Within weeks, it snowballed. Income streams that had been steady for years dried up. My savings, already modest, started shrinking. I found myself calculating groceries down to the dollar, weighing whether to keep my car or sell it before the payments became impossible. It wasn't just money, it was belonging. I'd been a part of so many circles, professional groups, volunteer committees, small community projects. Now, one by one, they quietly let me go. Officially, it was never about the situation. They used words like restructuring or budget cuts. But I could see the pattern. Nobody wanted my name attached to theirs. He didn't need to fire me or ruin my credit. All he had to do was make me radioactive. The physical stress began to show. I'd wake up with a knot between my shoulders, the kind that doesn't ease no matter how much you stretch. My sleep came in fractured pieces, each dream laced with that same feeling. Running through a maze, every exit bricked over. One afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found a letter from the State Oversight Committee, the same people I'd handed the evidence to. It was polite, formal, and devastating. Due to insufficient corroborating testimony and potential conflicts of interpretation, they were closing the case. I read it twice, 3 times. The words didn't change. They hadn't disproved my evidence. They just decided it wasn't enough to risk the fight. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter in my hands, and felt a cold wave wash over me. This was it. The fuse I'd lit had burned down, and instead of an explosion, there was just smoke curling into nothing. That evening, I went for a walk past his office. Through the window, I could see him leaning back in his chair, laughing with someone across the desk. Relaxed, untouched, victorious. For the first time since this began, I let the thought fully form in my mind. He's going to win. Not because he's right, not because the truth isn't real, but because the truth doesn't matter if no one will carry it with you. I turned away from the window before he could see me watching, my reflection disappearing into the night glass. That was the moment I understood. He hadn't just taken my reputation. He'd taken my place in the world. When you've been pushed to the edges of your own life, you start looking for any handhold, any rope that might pull you back. I told myself there had to be someone out there willing to stand beside me. Not necessarily to fight my battle for me, but at least to say, I believe you. So, I started making calls. Old friends, former colleagues, people I'd helped in the past. I didn't lead with accusations or demands, just small openings, testing the waters, trying to see who might still trust me enough to listen. The responses varied, but the pattern was the same. Hesitation, long pauses, careful words. Some were polite. It's complicated. I'm not in a position to get involved. Some were blunt. You've made your bed. And some were worse, friends who swore they supported me, but whose silence in public told another story entirely. I decided to try one more route, allies of his. Not the inner circle, I wasn't reckless enough to walk into that den, but people adjacent to his orbit. Maybe someone there had seen what I'd seen. Maybe they were just waiting for a reason to speak. One woman agreed to meet me for coffee. She arrived in oversized sunglasses, scanning the cafe before sitting down. Her voice stayed low as she stirred her drink, avoiding my eyes. I've heard things, she said finally. But you have to understand, if I talk, it won't just be him who comes after me. It'll be everyone who protects him. And they're not just powerful, they're patient. They don't forget. Her fear was real. I could feel it in the way she kept glancing toward the door, in the tight grip she had on her cup. By the time she left, I knew she wasn't going to help me. Not openly, anyway. The days blurred after that. Failed attempts at outreach, long hours alone with my thoughts. I'd never realized how much of my identity was tied to being trusted, being respected. Without that, even my own voice sounded different to me, as if I was talking through glass. One night, my phone buzzed with a blocked number. When I answered, there was a pause, then a voice I recognized instantly. I'm telling you this once, he said, calm as ever. Stop. You've already lost more than you realize. Before I could respond, the line went dead. The words should have scared me. But what I felt was something colder, something heavier. It was the creeping awareness that he wasn't wrong. There's a difference between losing battles and being betrayed. Losing stings. Betrayal cuts deeper because it comes from the hand you once trusted. I still had one person left in my corner, or at least I thought I did. Someone I'd confided in from the very beginning. Someone who'd nodded along as I recounted every detail, who told me I was doing the right thing even when everyone else drifted away. We'd shared late-night calls, exchanged messages of encouragement, even laughed together when the stress felt unbearable. They knew more about my fears, my doubts, than anyone else, which is why it hit so hard when I found out they'd met with him. It happened on a Tuesday. I was walking past a small cafe downtown when I saw them through the window, my last ally sitting across from him. Their body language was unmistakable, leaning in, listening closely, nodding. I stood there too long, frozen on the sidewalk, my reflection mingling with the scene inside. It wasn't just a friendly chat. It was a handover, information flowing in one direction. Later that week, the proof of their betrayal arrived in the form of a rumor I couldn't have planted myself. Something deeply personal, something I'd shared with them in confidence, suddenly found its way into the undercurrent of whispers around town. It had nothing to do with the case, but it painted me in an unflattering light, the kind of detail that corrodes credibility without needing to be proven. I confronted them. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, some misunderstanding I'd stumbled into. But they didn't deny it. They just sighed, looked tired, and said, "You're in too deep." I had to think about my own position. That's when I realized, loyalty isn't about the truth, it's about the cost of standing next to it. By the time I left that conversation, the last piece of the ground beneath me had given way. I'd been clinging to the idea that someone would stand with me until the end, but the end had come, and I was standing alone. That night, I didn't bother turning on the lights when I came home. I sat in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, and thought about how betrayal doesn't just take away trust in others, it erodes trust in yourself. Because if I could be so wrong about them, what else had I misjudged? In the distance, thunder rolled over the hills, and I knew the storm wasn't over. But I was done pretending I had shelter. When the noise around you becomes unbearable, there's a strange kind of quiet that follows. Not peace, exactly, but the stillness that comes after you've stopped fighting to be heard. I reached that point in the weeks after the betrayal. The phone calls slowed, the messages dwindled. Even the gossip seemed to fade. Not because it had disappeared, but because it no longer needed to be loud. The damage was already done. I stopped going to the usual places. No more grocery store at peak hours. No more cafe where I used to work on my laptop. I learned the times when the streets were empty, the shortcuts that kept me out of sight. It wasn't shame that kept me hidden. It was exhaustion. And in that quiet, I started replaying everything from the beginning. The first flicker of suspicion. The night by the library. The folder in the storage building. The decision to hand it over. Step by step, I walked myself back through the story, asking the same question over and over. Was it worth it? There were moments I wanted to say no. That maybe ignorance would have been a kinder fate. That maybe I should have let his secret rot in the dark, where it belonged. But there was another voice in me, softer but steadier, that refused to let go of the truth. It reminded me that the moment I opened that folder, the moment I saw the contracts and the letters, I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. To stay silent after that would have been its own kind of corruption. So I sat there in my small, dimly lit kitchen, surrounded by the echo of my own thoughts, and realized something important. He had taken my reputation, my position, my place in the community, but he hadn't taken the truth from me. No matter how thoroughly he'd rewritten the public story, there was still one version of events he couldn't touch. the one that lived in my memory, in the evidence I'd hidden away, in the unshakable knowledge of what I'd seen. It wasn't justice. It wasn't victory. But it was mine. And if nothing else, it was the thread I could hold onto when everything else had slipped away. That thread, thin as it was, kept me from falling into the kind of darkness that swallows people whole. Because I understood now, even in defeat, there's a difference between losing and surrendering. And I hadn't surrendered. In the months that followed, something unexpected began to happen, not in the world outside, but inside me. The sharp edges of anger dulled. The constant ache of humiliation softened into something quieter, something I could carry without it crushing me. And in that space, a small ember of defiance began to glow. It wasn't the roaring fire of revenge. No, that would have required an audience, and my audience was gone. This was something more private, an inner heat that reminded me I was still here, still breathing, still capable of choosing what I did next. I started to reclaim pieces of my life in small, deliberate ways. I returned to the walking paths I'd avoided, not caring if someone recognized me. I rearranged my home, not because I had to, but because I wanted my space to feel like mine again. I dusted off an old camera, taking photos of things no one else might notice, shadows on brick walls, the way rainwater pooled in the cracks of the sidewalk, a bird perched alone on a wire. These little acts didn't change the public story about me. They didn't undo the damage. But they reminded me that he hadn't erased everything. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky into a sheet of gold, I walked past the library where it had all started. I stood in the same spot where I'd hidden in the shadows months before. The building looked the same. The street lights still flickered. But I wasn't the same person who had stood there then. Back then, I'd been propelled by a need to prove something. Now, I understood the truth didn't need proving to matter, not to me. I thought about him, about the life he was still living, the position he still held. I didn't imagine him suddenly being exposed or punished. I didn't even want it anymore. What I wanted was to keep this ember alive, to live in a way that reminded me I hadn't been broken beyond repair. Because in the quiet of that moment, I realized something important. He could control the narrative. He could sway the crowd. He could win the public fight. But he could never own the part of me that refused to disappear. And sometimes, survival is its own form of victory. The day I decided to leave, the world felt strangely gentle. It was early morning, the kind where light spills in slowly, softening the edges of everything it touches. The air was cool, with just enough breeze to carry the scent of damp earth through my open window. I moved quietly through the house, as though raising my voice might disturb the fragile calm. I wasn't running away. I wasn't retreating. I was simply stepping out of a place where the fight had drained me dry. I packed without hurry. A few clothes, my camera, a stack of notebooks filled with half-finished thoughts. The folder, the one I'd scanned and hidden, stayed locked away in a safe place, not because I planned to use it, but because it was a piece of the truth, and I wasn't ready to let it go. As I moved from room to room, I let my eyes linger on the familiar. The sunlight striping the kitchen table, the worn arm of the chair by the window, the faint creak of the hallway floor. Each detail felt like a quiet goodbye. When I stepped outside, the street was empty. My footsteps sounded louder than usual, but even they seemed to fade into the morning air. I didn't look back. Driving out of town, I passed the landmarks that had been backdrops to the entire ordeal. The library, the cafe, his office. Each one blurred slightly in my vision, as though my mind was already placing them in the past. I wasn't naive. I knew my name here would always carry the shadow of what had happened. I knew he would keep his position, his power, his carefully curated image. And maybe one day, people would forget my side of the story entirely. But I also knew something else. There's a kind of strength in walking away when the world thinks you've been beaten. In choosing to leave on your own terms, instead of waiting to be pushed again. In keeping a part of yourself untouchable, even when everything else has been taken. As the town disappeared in my rearview mirror, the light grew warmer and the road ahead opened wide and quiet. And in that stillness, I felt it, faint but steady, the ember I'd been carrying, glowing against the cold. Not victory, not justice, but survival. And survival, I realized, was enough for now. I don't know where you are listening to this. Maybe it's morning, maybe it's night. Maybe you've walked through something that left you carrying your own ember, small and stubborn in the dark. If so, I hope you keep it, because even the smallest flame can keep you from disappearing entirely. Thank you for reading the whole story. Hope you will support my next products.